I know what you're thinking. Didn't he say he was done with regular staggered keyboards? Yes, but behold, a wild split has appeared. But there's more. This exquisite specimen also has modularity, on-the-fly modularity, and it's wireless. It also has a display, which I found both very useful and a little underutilized. And arguably the most tank-like tenting feed I have ever encountered, which comes with its own set of caveats. This is the Ultimate Hacking Keyboard 80, or UHK80 for short, the first keyboard ever where I had to read the manual first because I couldn't figure out how to turn it on. Once again, a quick disclaimer. This board was kindly sent to me by UHK, the makers, after I asked them. But the video is not sponsored, they didn't get any of this in advance, and if there's something I didn't like, I will let you know. Speaking of which, let me boot up my nitpicking services and start off with the general hardware overview. First impressions are always a tricky thing. For example, if you ever meet me in person, you're likely going to walk away wondering who put this together. Now, just like the Ghost 60 coming after the Voyager, the UHK80 essentially enters the arena with me still digesting the positive experience of the previous two, and this caused an initial skewed reaction on my side. Construction-wise, it simply doesn't live up to the $462 asking price, and that's without any of the modules, tenting feed, or the battery. Yes, you heard that right, the battery is an additional $33 option, which at first seemed a bit odd, but reading up on it, I actually like the approach UHK is going for here. If you don't need it, why get it? Why pay extra for something that is figuratively and literally a waste? This goes for almost all of the accessories, by the way. Even the dongle is an option, a $33 option. The downside to this is it adds up fast, and no amount of goodwill will change the fact that the hardware just doesn't match the price tag. That feeling is confirmed when looking at the exposed layers on the side and the occasional unevenness. There's also a noticeable flex in certain areas, courtesy of the all-plastic housing. But what the hardware lacks in refinement, it does to a certain degree make up for in flexibility. A lot of flexibility. Let's begin with arguably the visually most striking feature, the ability to break it apart whenever you feel like it, essentially converting this from a standard single-brick keyboard to a split with virtually infinite adjustment possibilities. This isn't the first keyboard of its kind, but it's the first one I experienced. There's plenty of other options out there too, even from major brands. The great thing is there's no restart required, you can just split it and continue your typing shenanigans uninterrupted. This state will also allow you to attach the optional modules, but more on these later. Let's focus on the main unit first. As the name suggests, this is a 80% keyboard, or TKL if you want to flex your abbreviation knowledge. This is substantially larger than a Korn or other splits that usually stay around the 60% or even smaller sizes like the Ghost 60 or the Voyager. Meaning we have a full numbers row, a full functions row, dedicated arrow keys, and these, whatever they are called. The board also only comes in an ANSI layout. There is technically an ISO version, including caps for a number of languages, but the only difference I could spot is the left shift key, which gets split. The enter key, for example, will always remain in its bar shape. There is even a write-up on their website regarding this, which I've linked down below if you're interested. Whereas this might sound a little limiting in terms of options, the other layout oddity is not. It adds a lot. I'm of course talking about the thumb cluster. If you're not familiar with split keyboards or non-staggered layouts where this is more common, this term might be new to you. It basically refers to having a cluster of keys around your thumb area to leverage your big stubby. Most often this is used to activate various layers, which was the case here too, apart from a few exceptions, but everything can be reconfigured to do pretty much whatever you want anyway. It did, however, take quite a bit of time for me to get used to, even though I come from thumb cluster heavy keyboards. The reason comes down to the 4 additional keys on the second row. This additional set was a bit overwhelming for my brain to process. What's more interesting though than my token limits is that they are using Choc V2 switches here instead of the standard Amex switches like the rest of the board. I believe this is the first time for me having 2 types of switches installed at the same time. Because they are both using Amex stems though, you technically can replace all of the keycaps with a standard set. But I'd reckon you're going to be hard pressed in finding something that doesn't end up looking like a cluster. Excuse me, I of course mean thumb cluster. Overall, the caps are very nice though. They are level, double shot, shine through and made of ABS, with some of them having side legends for their additional functionality, like the arrow keys under my right hand, which I very much approve. The only key I'm going to nitpick about is the print, because it seems to use a lighter font than the rest for some reason. I also like the slightly rougher texture, which made typing quite an enjoyable endeavor. Right below we find the permanently attached wooden palm rest, which, coming from the Go 60 again, filled me with joy as I very much adored it there, and here too. Since it's permanently attached, there's no need to fuss about it, and no extra cost. But I have to mention, especially compared to the Go 60, it doesn't look nor feel as premium. For one, the grain doesn't match up between the halves, and I'm not even sure they are from the same tree, with the right one looking just slightly darker than the left. But what do I know about wood? The only time this material comes up during my daytime operation is when I receive feedback regarding my performance. Moving on to the top right, we have the permanently attached display, which is something that I ended up liking a lot, especially after a little firmware modification. It's not the first time I had a keyboard with a display though. The Nomad E had the infamous color screen on its side, which did a lot, maybe too much. This one is stripped down quite a bit in comparison, but therefore also easy to understand and, most importantly, non-distracting, showing the battery life, charging indicator, all kinds of layers and modifier states, as well as the current profile and the connection mode, like Bluetooth. Speaking of Bluetooth, during the pairing process, the screen serves as your confirmation, which it does so by requiring you to enter a generated PIN code. This isn't unique, I've seen plenty of devices do this, but never on a keyboard. Like many other boards these days, the UHK80 is superbly fast at waking up the devices it is paired to. There's barely a noticeable delay. Bluetooth isn't the only option though. You can also get the mentioned dongle, which lowers the latency and noticeably improves the accuracy of the cursors when using the modules. So this optional accessory might be more necessary in case you plan on replacing all of your peripherals at once. Combined with Bluetooth, you'll technically be able to pair up to 20 devices with the UHK80, which is a lot and many more connections than I am capable of making. But you can of course also operate the board entirely wired using the USB-C ports on the back. There's one for each half. The left one is solely for charging though, and you will have to use it for that too, because even if you merge the halves, it won't charge. Alternatively, you can use the included curly cable to bridge the halves. This way you only need one USB-C cable. It's a bit confusing if you ask me, and you will notice this too, because when using the board completely wireless, the left half tends to deplete faster. That's because the right half has a larger battery in order to power more keys and the display. Maybe it's a different story if you have RGB enabled, but as I had the lights out during my entire runtime, I don't have any logs to validate this. Alright, let's move on to the various ways on how you can prop this thing up. When you flip the UHK80 on its back, you'll see various mounting options. The first ones are for the 4 included feet, which will give you the option to prop it up for 2 additional traditional typing angles. But flexibility is its name, and you can flip this around for a negative typing angle, something I didn't know was a thing. Personally, it's not for me, but what I did like was the ability to use them as tenting feet. You see, because of how the twist-in mechanism works, you can use these feet in all 4 directions, and actually found the minimal tenting angle in the collapsed state to be perfect for me. Of course, there's also a more aggressive and costly option in the form of the $99 Riser 80. Attaching it is unfortunately not as easy. You have to screw it to the underbelly of the UHK80, where you'll find 4 dedicated mounting holes for it. The good news is there's no need for a tool, as you'll have these neat little D-tap screws. The bad news is it's quite fiddly. It took me a few attempts to get them seated. In its defense though, it allows for quite granular and steep adjustments, in 5-degree intervals from 10 to 60 degrees in particular. And once you find the right height, the setup process is very fast. You just prop it up and you're done. Still, I like the included plastic feet more. They also didn't add any additional height to the board. But the choice is yours, which is something I started to notice more and more about the UHK80. Every feature seems to be optional and for you to decide if you want it and also how you want it. Which brings us neatly to the modules. Among the unique features of the UHK80, these are likely the biggest draw, or were to me at least. especially as a vocal supporter of having cursor input bound to your keyboard. However, as mentioned, without going splitsies, you won't actually be able to use any of these, as the connection only reveals itself once you break the board apart. You see, it uses the same connectors as the halves themselves. This also means you can swap them out on the fly, which I liked a lot. The seating is positively satisfying, albeit a little rough if you ask me. It's definitely not on the same level as some of the more refined mechanisms out there, but it is very sturdy, which is important considering that you're hammering around on these, likely in a suspended position. There are 4 modules in total: the key cluster, trackball, track point, and the touchpad, with each of them costing exactly $72 per unit. Let's start with the key cluster, which is the only one that can go on the left. That's because of how the connectors are designed, which is a bit restrictive. Having it bound to the left wasn't an issue for me though, as the tiny, and I really mean tiny, trackball was great at scrolling vertically as well as horizontally. You can technically also scroll diagonally by deactivating the scroll axis lock in the settings, but it's not as smooth as on the competition. The keys can be changed to whatever you want too, including the 2 mouse-like buttons, which I've mapped to backwards and forwards, as well as the ball itself, which acts as my middle mouse click. An additional configuration change I did wasn't based on software, but rather it concerned 2 of the 3 keys. By default, the corner of these was a little too sharp for my liking and would have cut right into my flesh if I had any. Luckily, there is an easy fix: simply rotate them by 180 degrees, after which the key cluster quickly became my favorite module. Second in place is the trackball, which has a much more swollen ball, but likewise contains 2 buttons, which by default act as your left and right click. This ball cannot be clicked, however, which I found a bit odd considering how small the other one is. Guess size doesn't matter after all when it comes to features. And I have a bit of an ergonomic complaint about it, too. You see, the key cluster module has the trackball positioned in a way that it's actually reachable without me having to move my left hand. My thumb naturally ends up over it. In contrast, the trackball is much higher up and actually not within the radius of my thumb, requiring me to move just a little bit. The same goes for my index finger, but maybe my hands are just too small for this, although according to my spec sheet I am average in every aspect of my existence. I must admit though, having 2 balls at my disposal feels superb. After having had 2 touchpads, this feels like another step towards harmony. Less harmonically sound was the track point. For anyone who ever owned an IBM laptop in the olden days, which I can count myself to as well, this is either going to flood you with a wave of nostalgia or PTSD. Unfortunately, it is the latter for me. If you don't know what this does, it's kinda like an immovable joystick that reacts to how much pressure you give it in order to move the cursor. I guess it's not so bad. At least it's entirely silent, which is something I can't say about the mouse buttons on any of these modules. They are, for the lack of a better word, very clicky. Lastly, we have the touchpad, which, believe it or not, has multi-touch functionality. This was very surprising to me because the Go 60 doesn't have this and is something people ask about in the comments. How useful multi-touch is on a surface of this size though depends a little on how you intend to use it. I don't really pinch and zoom, but I do value the double touch for right click a lot. The same goes for scrolling, which made me wish I could attach it to the left side. As much as I liked the key cluster module, I would have loved touch on the left and ball on the right, which makes me wonder. Just kidding, this does absolutely nothing. But it looks cool. Anyway, the perfect combination is still pending, but cluster and trackball is a pretty good start if you ask me. All of these modules can be configured just as easily and extensively as the rest of the keyboard, which brings us neatly to the software. This is the part of the UHK80 video I will praise the absolute most, for one simple reason: near instant flashing. I have complained a lot in my recent videos about having to compile the firmware first before being able to update my actual configuration. This isn't the case here, and it's because it runs neither QMK nor ZMK, which are popular firmware options for a lot of these types of keyboards out there. Instead, it's running on something called NRF Connect SDK, which means it also uses a different type of configurator, this time in the form of a dedicated app named UHK Agent. Like its competition though, the firmware is open source, and if you find yourself limited by the UI, the custom route is an option. But let's go through some of the basic features first before we talk more about this. Even though the UI might seem a bit simpler at first, especially compared to Oryx or MoErgo's web editors, I believe in the simplicity lies its strength, especially for someone like me whose key maps don't tend to be that complex. You could say I'm pretty much running basic. Starting out, you can pick one of the preset profiles like Colmac, Dvorak or good old QWERTY. I also appreciate the lengthy description you'll find on almost every configuration option, something that a newcomer or one who doesn't understand the lingo that well will be thankful for. For example, I first didn't notice that the mod tab feature was called secondary role here. If you're not familiar with this, it refers to having two different functions bound to the same key, with tapping executing one and holding the other function. Another neat feature I found is that whenever I had a new device paired to the keyboard, regardless of dongle or Bluetooth, the app would recognize this and create a profile. There's a list of all the devices you've paired with, and you can tell it to prioritize certain connections over others, if they are available. Pretty cool. Then there are the macros, or smart macros, which are way more than your standard keyboard combinations, although those are available too, of course. For example, I wanted to change the trackball speed whenever I held down one of the modifier keys. And to my own surprise, I managed to get this working, including visual confirmation. Again, pretty cool. Before we get to the custom firmware, in the interest of time, I will leave out all of the basic remapping and configuration capabilities. But rest assured, you can pretty much expect the usual here, from profiles to layers, remappings, and general configurations. You'll also find dedicated sections for each of the modules dealing with settings like tracking speed, acceleration, and so on. The options are actually quite extensive, despite the simple appearance. One thing about the modules I do want to highlight though is that you can bind the cursor behavior per module on a respective layer. This means the mini trackball of the key cluster, for example, could be configured as scrolling on one layer and as an actual pointer device on another. This opens up a whole level of fine-tuned specifics that can be quite interesting. I haven't yet found a way to incorporate this into my video editing workflow, but it is something I want to try out further, even after this video is done. Anyway, let's talk about customizing the firmware. Normally I wouldn't touch this, this is beyond my capabilities, but where there is a display, there is the urge to add Bongo Cat. Now, I can't go into detail on how this is exactly working, as it's mostly written by Claude code. However, regardless of the inner workings, if you wanted to modify the firmware yourself, you'll be happy to hear that it's pretty straightforward. Although it takes a while to set up, due to the usual packaging chaos that comes with systems like this, once it's running, it was a breeze to compile and flash the board. There are of course detailed instructions online on how to do this, and other keyboards are capable of this too of course, I just never needed it until now, mostly because the basic configuration was always sufficient. But as I said, the display is very alluring to play around with, and since there was no way to customize it with the software configurator, this was the only option. Although I didn't encounter any issues so far, I've only been blessed by the cat for the last couple of days. UHK assured me though that I cannot break the board, as the reset buttons on the back guarantee a hardware safety net, which I'm very glad exists. Speaking of breaking things, it's time to take it apart. The reason why I wanted to take the UHK80 apart was to confirm its easy battery replacement claim, which also includes adding the battery later on if you didn't purchase it initially. Now, if I had just spent 5 minutes googling, I would have quickly learned that there is a step-by-step guide explaining exactly how to do that, without taking the entire board apart. But I instead went the I know better route, which usually ends up in me contributing to the global landfill. In the end, I luckily didn't break it, but since I did take it apart and filmed it, might as well show you how it looks from the inside. The first two screws I tackled were the only ones visible from the outside, which held the top compartments in place, revealing the connector for the curly cable and the display on the right half, along with a lot of empty space. The rest of the screws was hidden underneath the keycaps, like so often, with two different types being present on this entire board. The shorter ones are used for the prongs that connect each half or the modules. The rest of the screws were all there to hold the steel plate in place. The construction is very simple. Basically, the entire board is held together by the case being screwed into the plate. The switch is sitting on top and then the keycaps. It's very stripped back, and as much as I like it when things are reduced to the parts that matter, even I have to admit, this feels a bit too minimal. I never really wished for an all-metal or aluminum case on a board that shipped in plastic, as most had a distinct philosophy in their choice of material. But here, I think the metal case would have greatly improved the perceived value. Anyway, I didn't go further than this because there was nothing else to discover. It's a bit anticlimactic, but I think in its simplicity also lies a certain beauty. For how flexible the UHK80 is, for how much and individual you can set it up, it's surprisingly bare bones. Now, putting all of this back together, I only had to figure out one final thing: how to turn it back on. I never owned a keyboard that I couldn't figure out how to power on, until this one. When I initially unboxed the UHK80, I was just at a loss as to how to get it working. Even after multiple plugs and unplugs, it just stood dormant on my desk. That's until I realized that the blinking keys were asking me to press them down in order to unlock the board. Dumbfounded, I wondered how I could have missed this, but it's actually a good analogy for the entire experience I've had. This is by far the most flexible board I ever tested. The sheer amount of options you can choose from and the fact that your initial purchase isn't taking away anything from future expansions is fantastic. Throughout my roughly 3 to 4 weeks of use, I continually changed, modified both software and hardware to fit my workflow. This might sound like as if I was continuously unhappy with it and needed to adjust it in order to finally get it to the way I wanted it to be, but I don't think that's the case. It's more like a sandbox to play around in, an exploration to get to the perfect setup. It's something other keyboards have promised but never delivered, at least not to this extent. This truly is the modular keyboard. But this flexibility is overshadowed by two things: the hardware and the price. The configuration I ended up daily driving is going to set you back $639 before shipping. In its defense, I never had any issues. It pretty much always worked, no matter how often I plugged, unplugged or attached and detached things. Only once there was a weird incident where the keys wouldn't register, but that might have been on my side, as I couldn't reproduce it. Luckily, this was fixed by a reset. Then there's the hardware. With everything else feeling so thoughtful, it makes this part feel off in contrast. It's similar to how you have to turn the keyboard on. The software lock is neat, but in practice I would have preferred a hardware switch. It would have just felt a bit more intentional. During the filming of this video, I also had the magnet come off for the key cluster module. This is an easy fix, but it still left me with a conflicted feeling about the whole thing. What I will say in favor of this hardware is it's much more repairable, or at least it seems to be. The construction is so simple that even if you'd lose the D-tab screws, for example, you could simply buy another set of screws to fix the riser 80 to the board. The UHK80 is a fascinating specimen. It can do a lot and adapt both in software and in the physical world to your needs, but you will have to pay the price for it, both figuratively and literally. Thank you so much for watching. In the next video we will go back to the living room. Until then, I'll be sitting in my charging cradle. Thank you again, and